Hi students, today we're going to look at Unit 3, Notes 8, Part 1 on Reconstruction. The Civil War has just ended. General Lee has just surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and we now need to rebuild our nation. The term Reconstruction, if you break it down, construct means to build, and re means to do it again. So rebuild or reconstruct. You're going to be using pages 17 and 18 in your notes packet to complete notes part 1 and 2. We start out with the assassination. Just 5 days after General Lee surrendered to General Grant and the war officially ended, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. The president was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The nation that was already in ruins from a long, violent civil war was now mourning the death of the president, and they would never have the chance to know how Lincoln planned on rebuilding the war-torn country. So we start out with an important vocab word. To assassinate is to kill a leader for a political purpose. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president upon Lincoln's death in April of 1865. President Johnson felt it was the job of the president to carry out the work of Reconstruction and to reunite the United States and rebuild the South after the Civil War. Johnson was a Southerner from Tennessee, and he had a racist streak. His idea of Reconstruction was aimed at getting white Southern farmers back in business. He was less concerned about the millions of blacks who had few skills and education and now needed jobs. So his focus was really on getting the Southern farmers back in business. Andrew Johnson, an important person in this section of notes, he became president when Lincoln was assassinated, and he began presidential reconstruction. So Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot and killed President Lincoln. The impact of that is that it put Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner, in charge of Reconstruction. President Johnson's Reconstruction Plan was announced in May of 1865. Former Confederate states could rejoin the Union when they had accomplished the following. So, if you're a Confederate state, you can join the Union when you have written a new state constitution, you've elected a new state government, you repeal the Act of Secession, saying, you're taking back the fact that you left. Got to agree to join again. Cancel out the war debts or pay off the war debts. And ratify an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery. They had to agree to get rid of slavery. All former Confederate states had accomplished this by the fall of 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution officially banned slavery in every part of the United States. It was ratified in December of 1865. Once this happened, Johnson announced that Reconstruction was complete. But was it really complete? Just because they've all rejoined the Union and the slaves have been freed, is that it? What happens to the former slaves now? In the timeline of Reconstruction, under 13th Amendment, you absolutely need to know these amendments. The 13th Amendment officially banned slavery in the U.S., December of 1865. And on your front of your packet on page 1, the 13th Amendment bans slavery. Please complete your timeline for this unit with that. Okay. So this idea of Reconstruction is the time when the South was rebuilt and brought back into the Union. Important vocab term. Rebuilt, reconstruct. Congress disagreed with President Johnson. They felt it was the responsibility of Congress to continue to carry out Reconstruction. The Northern Republican congressmen felt that Southern states needed strong measures in place to be sure that the new governments established in former slave states were based on equality. But President Johnson ignored Congress regarding Reconstruction, and he carried out his own methods for rebuilding the nation. Congress went as far as holding impeachment hearings for the president. You see, a president is supposed to carry out the will of the people, and the people are represented through Congress. And they determined that President Johnson's Reconstruction methods weren't enough, and because he was ignoring Congress, he was not doing his job properly. Johnson escaped removal from office by only one vote. So while the government argued over how to implement Reconstruction, Southerners were working to rebuild and begin new lives. The newly freed slaves lacked education and skills for high paying jobs. Former slave owners needed workers to farm their land, but the economic collapse of the South meant that they had very little money to pay workers. The solution, noticing it's in quotation marks, the solution that formed out of these circumstances is known as sharecropping. Poor whites and former slaves rented land from plantation owners to farm. There were two main problems, though. One problem is that former slaves were always in debt to the landowners. And the second thing is they were never getting an education to improve their circumstances. So, okay, well, we're going to give the former slaves some land to basically they could farm it out, they could make some money. But what it really did was it kept former slaves and poor white people in poverty and debt. So poor whites and former slaves rented land from plantation owners to farm. So the plantation owners get to collect rent from everybody, and then they're all still tied to the land. So the plantation owners get to stay rich, and the former slaves and poor whites stay poor. Frederick Douglass described the problems faced by former slaves called freedmen, after the 13th Amendment once slavery ended. Under slavery, slave owners provided everything their slaves needed. Housing, food, and clothing were all part of owning slaves. Once slavery ended, slaves were left with no way to provide for their basic needs. So, in response, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau. This agency was set up to provide short term help to former slaves with access to food and medical care. They helped arrange for wages and even helped distribute some land to get former slaves on their feet. The longest lasting impact of the Freedmen's Bureau was with education. They opened schools to teach thousands of former slaves, young and old. So, yeah, they had some short term impacts of food and medical care, and then long term impacts of education. So, a Reconstruction term to know is Freedmen's Bureau. This is the agency established to help and protect newly freed Black Americans. And again, you got that short term aid of food and medical care and long term of education. It wasn't surprising when the newly elected governments in former Confederate states began to look just like the old governments, run by the same people who led the South before the war. Once they were back in office, these governments began to pass legislation to restrict and control former slaves. They passed laws called Black Codes, which were meant to limit the civil rights and freedoms of African Americans. These laws denied former slaves voting rights. They could not serve on juries. Blacks who were unemployed could be arrested and sent to work for plantation owners. Black codes limited blacks to working low paying jobs. These states also passed laws requiring segregation of blacks and whites in public spaces. So, segregation means separation. So, while they were technically free, Black people in the South were struggling because a lot of their rights were being stripped from them. A sign of segregation that you can see at the top corner there. The Black Codes were laws passed in former Confederate states to keep whites in place of power, and the impact there was that it limited the rights and freedoms of African Americans. So just because the 13th Amendment passed to abolish slavery, it doesn't mean that life was easy street for African Americans, especially those living in the South. Struggling because when you have no way of gaining income, you have no education to get better jobs, and really no place to go, you're kind of stuck in a really hard place. The term segregation is the legalized separation of people in public places based on race and skin color. So segregation kept black and white separated. Segregate, separate. Okay, and that ends your part 1 of notes on Reconstruction, and we will take a look at part 2 on the next class period.